Even if you aren't terribly familiar with the world of philosophical debates and theories, you are probably familiar at the very least with the concept of consciousness. If you are a bit more familiar with discussions surrounding the word consciousness, then you have probably heard of something which is often termed the hard problem of consciousness. So why is there such a hard problem of consciousness? There are certainly difficult problems in other fields such as biology, mathematics, physics, and chemistry, but it seems to only be consciousness itself which presents us with a problem which we are not only unable to resolve, but which we are unable to even formulate in a comprehensive manner. Why does consciousness seem to be so uniquely mysterious among all other problems of science and philosophy? As with so many other stories which I have told on this channel, this one begins with René Descartes, a man whose ideas would come to lay the groundwork for the modern world in its entirety. Prior to the revolution and Western thinking brought about by Descartes, the world of Christian Europe and the neighboring Islamic world were both philosophically grounded in the metaphysical paradigms originally developed by Plato, Aristotle, and their successors. The world of Christendom, from which Descartes was born, was very much a Neoplatonic world. Within such Neoplatonic thought, one doesn't really find a problem of consciousness, or a correlative problem of free will and determinism, as Neoplatonic thought simply does not conceptualize the world in the same manner as we often do within our post-Cartesian world. The central axis of Neoplatonic metaphysics is the duality of form and substance, which could also be described as a duality of reality and appearance. Descartes, however, set himself the task of giving philosophy a completely fresh start. Descartes sought to begin a new philosophical venture first by systematically doubting everything which he could possibly call into question, including the veracity of his own perceptions and the existence of the world itself. Following through with this systematic doubt, Descartes would come to conclude that the only true foundation of certainty which could be relied upon was the reality of his own thought. I think, therefore I am. Beginning with this epistemological foundation, Descartes would then attempt to deductively prove the reality of the world beyond his own inner world. There's much more to be said about Descartes' method and its consequences, but for now, the most significant consequence I would like us to look to is the division of mind and matter. Just as the duality of form and substance served as a kind of central axis for classical thinking, the duality of mental and material substance would serve as the most fundamental division within the conceptual schemes of modern thought. Within this Cartesian paradigm, matter is considered to be the most fundamental constituent of the world we inhabit. Matter is understood to be that which is purely objective. It is that which exists independently of our subjective experiences, that which endures even when we are not looking. Matter is further understood to be something which is entirely beholden to what we call physical laws. We could take billiard balls as a paradigmatic metaphor of what matter is supposed to be. The billiard balls are not living agents. They are instead lifeless, inert objects which behave in accordance with pre-given mathematical constants. If a billiard ball moves across the table, then this event is due to a previous event, the ball being struck by another ball. The event is determined entirely by the structure of previous events. There is no consciousness or freedom understood to be at play here. The world thus comes to be understood as being fundamentally a kind of clockwork machine, in which objects of lifeless matter collide and determine one another in a continual cascade of deterministic events, much like a series of falling dominoes. A domino falls because it is knocked over by a previous domino. The object has no say in what happens. It is an event of purely mechanical interaction. If this seems obvious to you, then this is because of just how deeply ingrained the Cartesian paradigm has become in modern thinking, even if you yourself have never read or even heard of René Descartes. This way of thinking about matter was crucial for the subsequent development of physical science and modern technology. Modern science greatly prioritizes predictive certainty, and this prioritization relies on the assumption that the world behaves in ways that are fundamentally mechanistic and thus predictable. This predictive certainty then allows for control and manipulation. If we know the laws which determine how the world works, then we can take advantage of such deterministic regularities in order to control the world in consistent and reliable ways. We can create machines which operate reliably even when we aren't using them, such as engines and turbines. We can understand the world mathematically and use mathematics to make accurate predictions which allow us to manipulate the world to our advantage. Now, of course, the Neoplatonic thinkers who preceded Descartes certainly made use of mathematics and used mathematics and an understanding of the regularities of nature so as to create technological devices and architectural marvels. Nonetheless, the Neoplatonic and Cartesian worldviews are fundamentally distinct in that Neoplatonic thought regarded the world as alive, as animate, and thus as driven by the agency of suprasensory forms and archetypal beings such as gods and angels. Neoplatonic thinkers regarded living beings as fundamentally different than dominoes and billiard balls, and saw the world at large as being, in some sense, a great living entity. After Descartes, however, the modern mind came to understand the world as fundamentally mechanical in character, and thus came to understand the world's behavior as determined fundamentally by mathematical constants rather than by different modes of consciousness. Consciousness itself, conversely, came to occupy a rather tenuous place within the post-Cartesian picture of the world. If, like Descartes, we begin to see even biological bodies as essentially being squishy, complex machines, then where exactly does consciousness come into the picture? Descartes did, after all, rest his entire philosophical system on the foundation that was the self-certainty of his own consciousness. But it was precisely in this proclamation of self-certainty that Descartes seemed to drain consciousness from the world beyond his own mind. Descartes regarded consciousness as something fundamentally distinct from matter, but if we regard the world in this way, how can we be sure that there is consciousness anywhere other than within the confines of our own subjectivity? How do you know that I am conscious? Perhaps I am just a kind of squishy machine which is going through the motions of my life in a purely mechanistic manner, without having any subjective experiences whatsoever. Even if we decide that other human beings and even other biological organisms do have some sort of experiential subjectivity like our own, then we still have a problem as to how such organisms, which are themselves comprised of entirely objective matter, might come to be inhabited by consciousness. Does consciousness simply emerge as things become sufficiently complex? If so, then we have to somehow explain exactly when, why, and how a purely objective material system can suddenly achieve the first flicker of consciousness. Even if we regard consciousness as a kind of gradient, then we nevertheless have to somehow explain how a system with zero consciousness can become a system with the smallest possible amount of consciousness. When does 0% subjectivity become 0.001% subjectivity? What happens at the moment in which a completely different metaphysical dimension unfolds from a substrate of entirely inert matter? These questions are among those which have come to be dubbed the hard problem of consciousness. How does one get blood from a stone? How can the light of consciousness somehow emerge or enter into the absolute darkness of mere objective matter? As you have probably inferred from the title, I believe that there is no answer to this question, not because it is an utterly intractable mystery, but rather because it is not a problem at all. It is rather an impossible impasse which arises from a conceptual knot which must be cut rather than unwound. This issue is not simply a frivolous game of semantics which we should be dismissive of, as this is an issue which will bring us to the core of how our modern understanding of reality has come to be shaped, and the reasons why that understanding has repeatedly found itself faced with insurmountable walls. In cutting the knot of the hard problem, we will begin to get an idea as to what might lie beyond those walls, which have held science at bay for the past 4 centuries. So here I want us to begin by looking at what is often considered to be one of the first massive ruptures within the materialistic worldview of modern science. The development in the early 20th century of what we now know as quantum field theory. Now, there has been much ado about quantum theory since its inception. Many have argued that quantum theory indicates that consciousness must be fundamental to reality itself, or even that quantum theory shows us that things like telepathy and teleportation are likely possible. Others, conversely, have taken a much more deflationary attitude, arguing that quantum theory is ultimately just a bunch of interesting but ultimately non-spooky equations, and that we shouldn't attempt to interpret them as being anything other than one more collection of predictive tools employed by physical science. To begin with, quantum theory introduced something which many physicists were highly resistant to accept: a fundamental and inextricable indeterminacy. Quantum events simply cannot be understood to behave in a purely deterministic and predictable manner, and this seemed to be a very serious issue, as modern science had, up until the early 20th century, foundationally presumed that all matter should behave in accordance with predictable constants. Resistance to this introduction of indeterminacy is very succinctly encapsulated within Albert Einstein's infamous statement, quote, "God doesn't play dice with the universe." It is important to understand here that Einstein wasn't just waxing poetic by invoking God in that statement. Einstein himself was a kind of pantheist who believed that the universe itself was synonymous with God. Moreover, Einstein held to a view of God which had become dominant within intellectual circles following the Cartesian Revolution. This conception of God, often termed deistic, regarded God as a kind of mathematical clockmaker who in some manner determined the laws of the universe and then set the universe in motion. For Einstein, as with Spinoza, there was no distinction between God and the cosmos. The cosmos was understood to be a vast, intricately designed clockwork, but it was a self-designing clockwork, both artifice and engineer. For obvious reasons, the so-called dice rolls of quantum mechanics seemed unacceptable to Einstein, as they seemed to contradict the core presumptions of his scientific and spiritual understandings of reality. Further complicating the issue of reconciling quantum theory with the presumptions of modern science was the seemingly central role of observations in the determinations of quantum events. This so-called wave function collapse is a phenomenon with an enormous range of interpretations, and I'm not going to be giving a full overview of this issue here. For now, however, what is significant is that quantum phenomena seem to defy yet another foundational presumption of post-Cartesian materialism, that the world is made of matter and that matter is that which is what it is even when no one is looking. In drastic contradiction with this presumption, quantum phenomena only seem to achieve definiteness when we specifically look for that definiteness. Otherwise, quantum phenomena seem to exist in states of suspended indeterminacy or superposition, in which they can seemingly be in many distinct locations at the same time. If you want to learn more about just how strange superposition and wave function collapse can be, then I'd recommend looking into both the double slit experiment and the more elaborate quantum eraser experiments, and I'll be providing links to videos on both of those topics in the description box below. The implications of quantum mechanics were ultimately inescapable. The paradigm of the Cartesian clockwork universe simply would not hold to these revelations. As the wrecking ball of quantum field theory came to demolish the mechanistic dualism which had previously underpinned all of modern science, something clearly would need to replace that paradigm. That new framework, which would come to be the foundations of science over the course of the 20th and then 21st centuries, would be something radically new. The new metaphysical paradigm of modern science would be nothing. Absolutely nothing. Rather than actually using quantum theory as an opportunity to reformulate the presumptions of the Cartesian worldview, so as to develop a metaphysical framework which is more self-consistent and adequate to reality, academic scientists instead have largely opted for a kind of metaphysical and ontological quietism. If you ask a quantum physicist what quantum fields actually are, or what quantum particles actually are, or what the implications of quantum theory are for issues such as free will or consciousness, you might be lucky enough to get a very inconclusive and idiosyncratic speculation out of them. What's more likely, however, is that they will simply be more honest. They don't know. Maybe no one will ever know. Maybe we have simply reached the end of our cognitive ropes and have entered into territory which the human mind simply cannot make any satisfactory sense of. An article published in 2020 by Quantum magazine demonstrates this situation very clearly. In this article, senior editor Natalie Walkover interviewed a dozen particle physics researchers, inquiring as to what exactly quantum particles are. The answers she received were as diverse as they were utterly unenlightening. Such responses included: a particle is a collapsed wave function. A particle is a quantum excitation of a field. A particle is an irreducible representation of a group. Particles might be vibrating strings. And by far my personal favorite, particles are what we measure in particle detectors. When a supposedly foundational science such as physics is no longer able to even identify what the terms in its own equations refer to, it is only reasonable to ask, is this even actually science at all anymore? At this point, the situation might seem rather bleak. Those who are supposedly experts on the matter seem to no longer have any reasonable idea as to what matter is, pun absolutely intended. For close to 60 years now, and despite being endowed with financial resources which rival those of small nation-states, physicists have been unable to do anything other than excitedly point to graphs and explain to us that the information on those graphs is proof of things that were predicted to exist 60 years ago. As yet, no one seems to have any good ideas as to what the terms in quantum theory actually refer to, and most professionals in the field seem to have basically decided to leave those problems to those in philosophy departments, who will, when questioned on the subject, delightfully direct you back to the physics department as they don't have any good answers either. Although the physics community has been repeatedly assuring the world that new physics is just over the horizon any day now for 60 years, these promises have as yet remained almost entirely empty. We continue to use both quantum field theory and general relativity theory to explain the universe, and those theories continue to blatantly contradict one another, and physicists continue to insist that they will sort that all out. Eventually. Meanwhile, the so-called hard problem of consciousness remains just as conceptually incoherent as it was 400 years ago when initially implicated by René Descartes, and many have simply decided that the subject matter is just too spooky and woo-woo for science to have any business dealing with anyway. The issue here, as I see it, is not that quantum mechanics is simply too arcane to be comprehended, nor is it that consciousness is too mysterious to be dealt with in a scientific manner. The issue is that in order to properly address either of those subjects and many other related issues, will require us to abandon many of the fundamental dogmas which have hitherto served as foundational axioms of modern thought, modern science, and modern civilization more generally. The problem is not that we are faced with problems which demand extremely complex solutions. The problem is rather that answering these questions entails opening Pandora's box, and introducing ideas which will have an unstoppably acidic effect on the presumptions of modern science. Presumptions which academic scientists desperately wish to preserve at all costs. Dissolving the assumptions of the modernist paradigm necessarily entails the dissolving of the priestly aura of prestige and trustworthiness which academic institutions have commanded following the dissolution of the power once wielded by religious faith. I'm going to go ahead and end this video here, even though this definitely feels like a cliffhanger, but in the next video we are going to be looking at the metaphysical ideas of Henri Bergson and Alfred North Whitehead, two of the most central figures in what is now known as process philosophy, and looking at how their ideas can allow us to both make sense of the relationship between matter and consciousness, as well as how they can allow us to make sense of what is actually going on within the world of quantum field theory. As always, thanks for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe. The next video on the history of the Western world is also in the works, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, then you should totally check that out. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.